Kristen has served as chair of the Fall Lecture Committee, and her team as well, who are terrific. And I really so appreciate their diligence and creativity in planning this year's program. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Troy Scott-Smith, who is head gardener at Sissinghurst Castle. Troy has devoted his professional career to the beauty and romance of gardening. Since joining the National Trust of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland in 1990, he has led some of the world's most beautiful gardens, among them Courts in Wiltshire, Bodnet Garden in Wales, and 2 stints at Sissinghurst, where he has guided a remarkable transformation and restoration of the Vita Sackville West Gardens. I'm sure you all know that Sissinghurst was created nearly a century ago by writers Vita Sackville West and Harold Nicholson as a private home, but also as a refuge dedicated to natural beauty. And today, under the ownership of the National Trust, it is visited annually by hundreds of thousands of people. And so we are really thrilled to have Troy here to talk to us about this amazing garden. But before inviting Troy to the podium, may I please ask you to silence your cell phones? I just checked mine. And also, following his talk, we will hope to take a few questions before ushering him across the hall into the library for our reception. You are very welcome to meet and chat with him there, but please don't pin him behind this podium. Let's give him a chance to get a drink. Okay, so thank you all very much. And Troy.
Thank you, Beth, for that very generous introduction. And firstly, thank you to everybody who was connected in getting me here today. I know it's a big team effort, so thank you very much. And thank you all for coming along and joining us this evening at such an incredible and interesting venue. I think it's the nicest venue I've ever spoken at, so thank you all round. So my first meeting with Sissinghurst was when I worked there as a gardener. I joined Sissinghurst in 1992, and I worked there for 5 years honing my craft as a gardener. It wasn't long before I returned as head gardener, so in 2013 I returned to Sissinghurst as head gardener, since which time I've really been immersing myself not only in the garden but also in the characters of Vita and Harold, the people who created the garden. And together with my team of 6 full-time and 2 part-time gardeners, we're really developing a way of gardening that places beauty and romance first. So I'm delighted to be here, if a little bit daunted by the knowledge in the room, but nonetheless delighted to share with you some of that magic of Sissinghurst, but also some of the challenges that we face in managing such a complex flower garden, and also some of the thought processes that go around some of our actions. So that's the idea for the next sort of 50 minutes or so. So Sissinghurst is the epitome of the English garden. It was created over a period of 30 years, from 1930. And it's a combination, I suppose, of the floral design, the exotic and romantic beauty of Vita Sackville West, a poet and novelist and garden writer, and the formal design of her husband, Harold Nicholson, the writer and diplomat. And Vita died in 1962, and Harold survived and died in 1968, and Sissinghurst was handed over to the National Trust in 1962. And you'll know, I'm sure, the National Trust is founded in 1895 by 3 people with a simple and enduring idea that we need places that are historic, natural and beautiful. 130 years later, those same principles and values are at the heart of everything we do. National Trust is completely independent of government. It's the largest conservation charity in Europe. And together we protect, restore and look after not 650 miles but 1,000 miles of coastline, 650 acres of our most precious land, 350 historic houses, 222 gardens in which we employ 600 gardeners, 101 head gardeners, and collectively we look after over 4 million plant accessions. We have nearly 6 million members, 60,000 volunteers giving 5 million hours, and we welcome over 23 million visitors to our paid-for-view properties. So even though we're passionate about open spaces and historic places, we also work hard in other areas too, including energy, the environment, food, farming, transport, and we're committed to playing our part in mitigating the negative effects of climate change and the other big challenges that we face in the 21st century. So Vita Sackville-West was born at Knowle House in 1892. She's the only child of her parents, and because of that she couldn't inherit Knowle. Knowle House, well, Vita loved Knowle. It's this large, ancestral 17th century house most of you will have visited, I'm sure. Reputedly the largest private country house in England, with a bedroom for every night of the year. But when her father died then in 1928, it passed to her father's brother, and Vita was completely bereft of this thing that she loved more than anything else in the world. It was in 1930, together with Dorothy Wellesley and her son Nigel, that Vita visited Sissinghurst for the first time. She found out that it was for sale, and on that April morning she went to visit. Sissinghurst was another house in Kent from a similar period as Knowle, late 16th century, with courtyards and tower, and the part of Kent that Vita loved, the Weald of Kent. However, Sissinghurst was in ruin over the centuries. It had disintegrated over the centuries. So there was this strange coming together, if you like, of this ruination of Vita's expectation of Knowle with suddenly finding another Knowle. And Vita immediately understood that she could somehow redeem her life, not by building with bricks and mortar, but by making a garden here, by reinvesting life in the ruin with flowers. Sissinghurst has many centuries of embedded history. A moated medieval manor house and Saxon pig farm once stood where the present-day orchard is, the moat remaining as part of the garden today. Then a Tudor and later Elizabethan mansion was built with tower and courtyards, again, some of which form the anatomy of the garden to be. The tower remains here, the front range, the priest's house, and this cottage here, this part of the Elizabethan courtyard still remains today as well. Then between 1756 and 1763, the Tudor buildings and Elizabethan buildings were used as a prison for up to 3,000 French prisoners that were captured, French sailors that were captured by the British during the 7-Year War. Much of their graffiti can still be seen in the castle and the buildings today. And then for a century, from 1796, Sissinghurst was used as a poorhouse where 100 men were offered housing and food in return for work on the farm. So although Vita and Harold's marriage might have been difficult, their collaboration on the garden at Sissinghurst seems to have been easy. They knew that they had an opportunity to make a garden that drew on that sense of embedded history and of an abandoned past. It matched his talent for conceptualising space with her sensibility for colour and romantic imagination. And they agreed entirely upon the aesthetic approach that the garden would follow, a garden of long axial views and vistas running north-south, east-west, usually terminated by a focal point of a statue or vase, and opening off these axes, small geometric rooms, 10 in total, very much like the rooms opening off the main hallway of a large country house. It is worth remembering that in 1930 there was no garden. The place had been on the market for several years, since 1924, and there was nothing but a dreadful mess and a tangle of weeds everywhere. However, this slovenly disorder that Vita described didn't matter to her. In fact, the wildness inspired her. She said, "It caught at my heart and my imagination. I fell in love at first sight. And so although some of the brick and some of the Tudor and Elizabethan walls survived to form the anatomy of the garden, they shot off at odd angles. For instance, the tower isn't opposite the main entrance. The courtyard itself is coffin-shaped, not rectangular. And it was a very difficult sight to imagine. However, they turned this ramshackle ruin of the Elizabethan castle that they found to their advantage, using the disjointed layout as a template for the design of their garden. Today it feels effortless, well-paced, and in good proportion. I suggest that no garden has had greater influence on the second half of the 20th century, more so than Sissinghurst. It's a garden inextricably linked to the buildings it surrounds, and in turn the Kentish farmland that sweeps up to its walls. Its inspirational hold on and influence on amateur gardeners seems to span the generations. But Sissinghurst for many years has been treated as a very important garden, a garden that had to be gardened to the highest horticultural standards, but without much attention to the poetry of the place. The idea that it wasn't simply a beautiful display ground for all the most exquisite plants, but itself a work of art. So since 2013, that understanding has come back to Sissinghurst, and the main mechanism and impulse in that is our research and our understanding into exactly what Vita and Harold wanted the place to be. Sissinghurst was in fact Vita and Harold's third garden. Their first overlooked the Golden Horn in what was Constantinople, where they lived following their marriage in 1913. There was a little terrace garden that sloped down to the sea. There was a pergola of grapes, and everywhere roses looped through lilacs. In 1915, they acquired Long Barn, a dilapidated cottage near Sevenoaks, not far from Sissinghurst, and here they would make their second garden of lawns, terraces, and Vita would develop her planting style, theory-free and instinctive. And Vita was particularly fascinated by plants with historical or literary associations. Her passions for plants was often shaped by the plant species she saw on her travels to places like Persia and the Alps. The romantic association of flowers with the past, with painters and faraway places, were an influence in her choice of planting. Romantic yet practical, experimental but traditional. So Englishness with a thread of the exotic woven through was the quality that they most wanted to achieve at Sissinghurst. Hence the idea of Tudor-linked enclosures, lawns, hedges, native yews, and the smaller wildings like primroses or violets. However, the planting style is one part, but just as important is the actual management of the planting, the restraint in the pruning, and allowing plants to grow beyond their horticultural perfection. Adam Nicholson, Vita's grandson, puts it so well. He says, "This is the reimagining of the garden as a lovely humane space and not some horticultural display cabinet, but part of the substance of life." And so in 2014, we brought our research and our understanding together to write a 10-year manifesto, a vision, if you like, that places romance and beauty at the heart of everything we do. A series of interventions and actions would follow that together would return an authenticity to Sissinghurst. So a romantic garden in a rural setting would be our touchstone, our starting point for all our actions to follow. Or as Vita wrote about Sissinghurst, a garden in a ruin in a farm. So Vita and Howard lived in a most extraordinary way at Sissinghurst, eating, sleeping, working in the various buildings scattered around the 5-acre garden. And this meant that the garden wasn't some kind of single adjunct beside the house, but completely integral to their lives. And their aim at Sissinghurst was never to make a great garden for posterity. For them, the garden was a refuge, a place for living in, solely for their own pleasure and for their own enjoyment. However, fascinated by Vita's weekly gardening articles in the Observer newspaper, which she wrote for 15 years from 1946, early visitors did start to seek out the garden. And these early pilgrims, though small in number at first, opened the gates, if you like, for mass garden tourism. And Sissinghurst led the way, with visitor numbers reaching a peak of nearly 200,000 visitors way back in 1991. So in my view, the garden was dangerously close to becoming a victim of its own success. Pasture and orchard had become car park. Once functioning farm buildings were now toilets, restaurants and shops. And within the garden, vistas had become occluded, lawn areas had become paved paths. And although many original details and plantings persist 60 years after Vita's death, changes in planting and maintenance lends an overall tone to the garden that differs from that of the garden of the 1940s and 1950s. Vita put so much of herself into the garden. Its distinctiveness is expressed as much through the planting and their placement as through the design and layout of the garden. And once such an individual has died, it's so easy for that prevailing character and spirit to be overlaid, gradually diluted, and eventually lost. You see, Vita's garden had an all-over easiness, an ease that comes from nature and gardener working in harmony. The pulse of the garden beat slowly. It was nourished by patience and rich in emotion and intimacy. A kind of haphazard luxuriance permeated the entire garden. The walls were encrusted with roses, foaming and frothing in exuberance, and everywhere fat cushions of plants sprawled and spilled over paths, lending a lavish and romantic quality. Anne Scott James, the author, I think, puts it so brilliantly. She said, "Sissinghurst was full of flaws, but just as the flaws of a hand-thrown pot have a charm which a smooth machine-made pot can never equal, so while the imperfections of Sissinghurst utterly delightful, they were part of his intensely personal character." Vita also had a very real and immediate relationship with the land, the idea of the timelessness of the Weald, the buildings growing out of the land, the materials being of the land. She would not have made a garden if it wasn't surrounded by a working farm and rooted in the Weald and clay. And not wanting to be unfair, because I'm not suggesting any of my predecessors have done anything wrong, but if you compare this photograph of the top courtyard at Sissinghurst in the 1950s, and just look at some of the qualities to it. The yews are beautiful and craggy. The roses grow full of expression up to the eaves of the house. The pots are a little bit beaten up, but charming nonetheless. The rosemaries spill over the path. And compare that with the garden of 2013. Beautiful garden, perhaps, one that we might desire, maybe, but too clinical, too emotionless. The lawn is perfect and weed-free. The yews are clipped like torpedoes. The plants squashed to the wall without any feeling or emotion. And talking of which, are those visitors, are they in the picture? Are they present? Are they in the garden? Or are they just ticking it off a list? We want people to really feel something in the heart when they visit Sissinghurst. Likewise, in the herb garden, in the 1950s, Vita's yew hedge, clipped precisely, but also with some character. The pointing in the Yorkstone paving, absent, instead filled with lovely thyme, aromatic herbs. And under the bowl as well, just some lovely self-seeding. Again, compare and contrast with the herb garden of 2013. Still a very beautiful space, but the pointing now replaces those fragrant herbs, and not a very nice colour pointing. The hedges clipped a bit too tight. And under that beautiful marble bowl which Vita and Harold used to have in their living room in Constantinople, it now sits on this little pedestal with this quite nice arts and crafts tiles on edge, but completely absent in Vita and Harold's garden, and not required. It wasn't trying too hard to please. It was just as it was. There we go. So this is the garden now, and the change is subtle from the garden of 10 years ago. but it is an accumulation of small interventions that added together start to make the difference. We want Sissinghurst to be a garden of timeless quality, where flower borders bloom in an orthodox exuberance and roses tumble from the walls in lavish swags. I hope it is a garden that doesn't try too hard to please, and a garden where peninsulas of farm and fingers of orchard come up and reach and connect with the garden and have that dialogue once again with the Wealden clay that surrounds it. So today we are gardening in a way that looks to recapture the distinctive qualities of Vita and Harold Sissinghurst, a more reflective, romantic, slower, deeper place. The paradox is that the preservation of the garden at Sissinghurst is that its beauty really consists of a dialogue between the old and the new. And so we must constantly navigate that intersection between what was, what is, and what might be. Harold Nicholson again says that this is a dream made real, or is it the reality dragged towards the condition of a dream? For me, past, present and future should all equally coexist. It's not change that matters, but the nature of that change. And so in the nursery, for example, Vita and Harold's multicoloured polyanthus that were there for nearly 40 years disappeared in the 1970s to be replaced by this woodland planting, where these woodland plants seductively colonise the half-lit pools of light. And now this is accepted as Sissinghurst and is cited as many visitors as their favourite part of the entire garden. In the cottage or sunset garden at Sissinghurst, which was a favourite of both Vita and Harold's, you can see, well, really the first thing that strikes you is the sheer range of colour that Vita used in her garden, from the vibrant colours here in the sunset garden to the melancholy colours in the purple border. Vita's palette was sophisticated and cutting edge. She embraced all colours and used them in new and exciting ways. Vita's most dramatic use of colour, however, can probably be found in the legendary White Garden. It's an essay in the use of flowers and foliage within a very narrow and limited palette of grey, green and white. And without the immediate attraction of the mixture of colours, our attention is drawn to the more enduring qualities of texture, form and shape. And although not unique, it was rare at the time, created in 1949-1950, the White Garden was the last of the gardens at Sissinghurst to receive its identity. Most of the garden was laid out in the 1930s. It became the culmination of Harold and Vita's joint vision for Sissinghurst. It fuses poetic theatricality, horticultural expertise and classical control. It represents the plantsmanship of Vita at its most highly developed. The White Garden was to become one of the most celebrated and influential gardens of the 20th century, copied thousands of times all over the world. And we're blessed that Vita and Harold were well-organised gardeners, avid letter writers and diarists. As a result, we have a rich archive of material to draw upon to help us understand the garden. Not only here can we see that the layout on the left in the White Garden has changed both during but mostly after the death of Vita and Harold. We can also interrogate Vita's notebooks, and this is less than 12 months before she died. And when you look at the detail in there, makes such interesting reading, of course. There's information in there. People ask me, was Vita a gardener? There's something there that says white campanulas in Delos. Save seed, I have tied green string around 2 or 3 clumps. You know, that's a very practical, hands-on gardener writing that. And this idea of it being well organised, ticking things off and writing the word done, done. And also further up somewhere, there's something around growing clematis and solanum and roses up the trunks of magnolia trees and the fig as well. So it's so interesting to read and to interrogate these diaries and documents that we're lucky to have. And then when we look at the White Garden, we can see some of Vita's influences, of course, still today. but we also see change. And it's some of this change that we consider and we think deeply about. You can see Vita's white garden on the left. She had this spine of almond trees that ran down the middle, and within that central area, a group of 8 almond trees formed a living arbour where Rose the garland, grew up. Beautiful, expressive, free and wild. They disappeared in the late 60s, early 70s to be replaced by this metal structure we can see on the right-hand side. Very nice, very beautiful, lots of people love it, but it's not original to Vita's original garden, but something more than that. It takes away that spine that they had running the full length of the garden here, north-south. And also it feels a bit too designed, a bit too static. So should we remove it? Should we replace it again with the almond trees and loop the roses through the boughs of the trees as they become older? Questions yet unanswered, but on our mind. So I spoke quite a lot about Vita, rightly so. Harold dedicated the garden to her after she died. But Harold, of course, played an equal part. And it's the line walk of all the 10 garden rooms that is the only one that Harold both created and planted solely. He described it as MLW, my life's work. Vita, perhaps less flatteringly, described it as reminding her of Platform 5 Charing Cross railway station. The Line Walk had its own gardener, Sydney, and I met Sydney's nephew just a few weeks ago. And capturing that oral archive from him was very beautiful. And Harold paid Sydney himself. The rest of the garden was financed by Vita. But the walk is formed by these 2 rows of pleach limes, central walkway of what now is a Yorkstone path. And we think of Sissinghurst as this very respectful garden. But this Yorkstone path is also a National Trust invention. Previously, Harold and Vita had multicoloured concrete paving here, of green and pink and gold, and this was replaced in the 1970s. Surrounding and enclosing the Line Walk is a hedge of hornbeam. And for Harold, beset with some career problems, the Line Walk was a solace as well as a creative occupation. He would spend his week working in London and return at the weekend to catalogue, look and weed within the Line Walk. And essentially it's a garden of spring bulbs, and we have tulips, wild tulips from Greece, we have crown imperials from Persia, muscari from Afghanistan, all of these beautiful dry-liking bulbs. And he spent 16 years cataloguing every single thing that flowered, how many flowers it had, until the year that Vita died in 1962. And so these we also interrogate to try and understand, not so we can copy, but just so we can work from evidence and from knowledge. The nicest thing that I've seen Vita write to Harold was this letter that she wrote to him when he was in London, and she walked up his spring garden and she said, "Your little red flowers bit and tore at my heart. How I love you so, just that, how I love you." And for me, it just resonates so strongly about not only their love for each other, but their love, of course, for the garden. So here we see Vita's love not only of delphiniums, but also her way of planting. She was president of the Delphinium Society. But she was comfortable, you see, for each garden room to have a single glorious moment in flower, centred on her favourite plants. Very much like turning those lights off in that large country house as you move from room to room. This natural rise and fall of Vita's planting provided a natural rhythm that was in tune with the seasons and in tune with the land. And so they would move from the spring garden or the Line Walk to the nuttery, to the white garden, to the rose garden, to the cottage garden. And that meant that each one could have a peak, could have this huge climax, rather than diluting the moment with trying to make it look good for 12 months of the year. And there's something so nice and real about that. I think I enjoy increasingly the idea of this single moment gardening and look forward to that moment rather than having it whenever I want it. as well as delphiniums that we continue to grow today. Roses are also the central part of the style of Sissinghurst and completely appropriate to Sissinghurst's soft abundance, subtlety and romance. And roses summon from Vita, I think, her richest garden writing. She said of the old roses, "Those dusky, mysterious hours in an oriental storehouse where the rugs and carpets of Isfahan were unrolled in their dim but sumptuous colouring and richness of texture for our slow delight. Rich they were, rich as a fig broken, soft as a ripened peach, freckled as an apricot, coral as a pomegranate, bloomy as a bunch of grapes. It is of these the old roses remind me." And through further research, we now understand and know that Vita grew over 350 old roses, those bred before 1867. And again, we interrogate these notebooks, but we were really fortunate to uncover, by digging in the garden, old labels. And all of these here are rose labels that once would have been growing in the garden, that now we track down and try and return to the garden. In 2013, we only had 100 of these roses, and now we've only got around 25 missing still. So we've still got some to go, but we've tracked down and replaced many of them back to Sissinghurst. And the other plant that Vita loved so much was the bearded iris. Along with old roses, they formed an important part of the early summer garden at Sissinghurst, often planted in generous slabs along the path edges and under the skirts of the roses. The irises that Vita grew were the intense, saturated colour that she found so irresistible, including Melchior on the bottom left and Shanapin on the top, which interestingly was bred by an American who was superintendent of the Pittsburgh sewer department. Anyway, our focus remains very much on Vita and Harold and our 10-year manifesto of 2014. But as we move towards Sissinghurst centenary in 2030, we also now think to the future. And if we felt gardening was difficult over the last 10 years, I can guarantee it's going to be much more difficult over the next 10 years. And so I want to think about some of our focus. Our first is really our people. These gardens wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the group of talented, creative and brilliant horticulturalists that look after them. And it's so easy, of course, in a public garden to be sidetracked by process, presentation, health and safety, visitors, budgets. But actually it's this group of gardeners which for me are the most important asset that we have. And so we're really trying hard to develop, give them the opportunities that they need, because recruitment is difficult. There's not the colleges to train these gardeners anymore. We're not finding that they're applying for jobs. If they do apply, attrition is quite high. So we really need to think about the investment in this group of people. But that's broader than the full-time permanent gardeners. It's also about how else we can have Sissinghurst to be a place not just of propagating plants, but of propagating gardeners for the future. And so as well as our local volunteers that come and help us on a weekly basis, we've welcomed just this year alone 27 visiting professional gardeners who stay a week or more at Sissinghurst from all across Europe, from America, from Australia. And it's that sharing of knowledge, sharing of ideas that can only benefit. And our flagship programme as part of this development of our people is what we call our Sissinghurst Scholarship. And I won't say anything more about it just yet because we have a little video I'd like to show you. And I'm told you Americans like just plain talking, so this is my promotion where we really need your help, your support, your help in funding the future of our scholarship programme, because without donations it can't continue. So we can play the video. It's just a few minutes long. So we're just 2 years in now into this exciting scholarship programme at Sissinghurst. It's such an amazing opportunity for people to actually dive deeply into horticulture, into the spirit of a place, into the mood of and character of a garden, and really understand how to garden and look after that place for the future. The scholarship programme came about through a kind gift specifically for horticultural training. It's really important that these gardens really have the talent to be able to look after them. And so through the scholarship programme we really want to take the best of that talent and accelerate their learning, their experience through gardening at one of our special gardens in the National Trust.
There's a sense of history here, but at the same time it's dynamic and moving forward. I think it's a really special opportunity for the scholars because it's a practical learning environment, but there's a lot of flexibility, and we're very much keen for the scholars to direct some of their own learning. They have some individual projects, but also they have the opportunity to go and work in some other gardens. That gives you an ability to reflect on practice in a way that you don't necessarily get if you're just in one focused place.
When I started the scholarship, I didn't know the direction I wanted to go into. And that was one of the good things about the scholarship, because you can tailor it very much to your interests. So as I was studying and learning on the scholarship, I found I was really interested in the science of plants, and I was really supported in that learning by members of staff who also encouraged me to apply for the Q diploma.
I appreciate how self-directed it is as well, because I've got so many interests that I want to follow, and it's really easy for me to just go down a rabbit hole. But because I sort of spend half my time in the nursery and half my time in the veg garden, so a couple of days a week each place, I really do get to kind of like be immersed in each of those environments for the time that I'm there, which is great. So yeah, it's been really, really good.
As part of the programme, I get to lead our Sissinghurst team here through a head gardener week. Learning firsthand from Troy, our head gardener here at Sissinghurst Castle, is integral to how the scholarship runs, and being able to work under him and shadow him and see how he does things day to day is incredible. It's first-hand experience, and is something that I will take away when I further on my career and go ahead into the National Trust and hopefully be a head gardener of the future.
It's like a finishing school almost. You can do your exams and you can go into employment, but this extra piece of opportunity and horticultural expertise that you learn from senior gardeners and senior propagators is just second to none, and to have that invested in, we are really so very grateful for that.
I'm just really grateful to all of the donors that have made this possible, because without it I wouldn't be on the path that I am now, and Sissinghurst would not have been able to support me without people leaving money in their wills to Sissinghurst to make this possible.
It's so crucial that then we can secure funding to embed this programme, not just here at Sissinghurst, but actually beyond the garden here. And the benefit of that is that each of these gardens has very different styles, really, different management and maintenance techniques, and so there's so much to learn from both, and so the opportunity will be broadened to 2 and hopefully further gardens in the future.
I came to live at Sissinghurst when I was 8, about a week after my grandmother Vita had died, and of course the place was still absolutely hers. But here was this enchanted garden, and I like to think that if somehow or other I could magic her back here and introduce her to the scholar, so that 60 or so years after her death, she could be wowed by the news that her legacy was being handed over, the inspiration that her work has given to carry it forward into the 21st century, to see what Troy and his team have put together here, which, I mean, in my view, I don't know if Vita would agree with me, has never looked more beautiful.
If you're able to support the scholarship in any way, particularly gifts in wills that are a vital source of income for the National Trust, it will mean that the scholarship programme is secured for generations to come. Thank you. So, yeah, it would mean a huge amount for the continuation of that scholarship programme if any of you were able to help, and delighted to chat with any of you later. But moving on, our other challenges beyond trained gardeners, and it really needs no introduction, is climate, and now it's really obvious that the climate's changing and it's more unpredictable, and it's making a huge difference to the way that we garden at Sissinghurst in very simple and obvious ways, that the grass keeps growing 12 months of the year. We can't prune roses when we used to because they're still full of leaves, but also, of course, in more fundamental ways. 2 years ago, we had a summer that got to 40 degrees. I think that's about 105 Fahrenheit. Unheard of for, the southeast of England. And that's goes in combination with also cold. So the winters are still cold. We can get minus 12, about 10 degrees Fahrenheit regularly. And that year that it was dry, and hot, it was dry also. It was dry for 43 days. It rained once and then stayed dry for 73 days in total. So these are just very difficult extremes to work with. So it is the summer drought and the summer heat, but then also the winter wet. And the range of plants, the palette of plants that can cope with those two extremes is minuscule. And so, what will our plants be, what will our gardens be populated with in the years to come? I'm really struggling to sort of comprehend, really. So we are thinking about irrigation, and we feel that Sissinghurst, we've spent 3 years not watering, and we've come to the conclusion that actually the garden is really struggling. So if we do feel it's worthwhile to invest in irrigation, but that needs to be in a sustainable way. So we need to harvest that water, we need to have storage, and we need an automated system of delivery. So that's not straightforward or simple. We've also stopped spraying with chemicals, we don't use synthetic fertilisers, and these are all different ways to garden. That means that it seems very transitional at the moment, very uncertain exactly what the future will look like. But we're trying to lean into these challenges and trying to, to really set the pace and to then spin out our learning to other heritage horticultural sector, so we can lead from the front. So we've also undertaken this biodiversity baseline audit to really understand the ecology of the garden, what we share the garden with. The results of this will start to inform our gardening, and hopefully we will see an enhancement of some of the biodiversity that inhabits the garden. We're blessed, of course, that the garden isn't sitting in isolation. It's surrounded by 470 acres of estate. On our southern flank we have ancient woodland, lakes, permanent pasture. On our north side we have some arable, but it's also where we're doing more with our 10-year farm project. We're widening hedgerows and margins, planting copses, developing water scrapes, so we get different species moving into and living within the garden and the estate at Sissinghurst. And it's these vernacular crafts and tasks which we really feel are important as well, that we should hand on from gardener to gardener. And using the materials, using the chestnut for coppice, using the hazel to make fencing, scything the meadows. It's all part of the bigger picture. We have a vegetable garden as well that's completely organic. We've gained organic status for the first time just a year ago, and we harvest over 8 tonnes of material of produce every year that we sell through the shop and give to the restaurant. But just returning back to the main garden, and for this final little section, And it's really the last piece of our 10-year manifesto that we wrote in 2014 was the reimagining of Delos. Some of you will have been to Delos, I'm sure. In 1935, Harold and Vita visited the sun-baked island, part of the Greek islands of the Cyclades. In Greek mythology, Delos was the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, a mythic isle possessed of a sacred harbour and sanctuary dedicated to Zeus. And Vita and Harold were quickly spellbound by the island's ancient ruins, softened here and there by the colourful carpets of the aromatic wildflowers. And on returning to England, Harold and Vita identified a plot at Sissinghurst in front of a priest's house where they attempted to recreate the ancient landscape that they'd been so entranced by. It was, of course, inherently crazy to think of making Delos in Kent. All the environmental signals were wrong, and from the start it was a complete disaster. Nothing really grew, and it didn't look like their vision of the sunlit, beautiful, dry island that they saw. The spot they had chosen was north-facing, and unusually for such such experienced amateur gardeners, their knowledge of Mediterranean plants was sorely lacking. And in recent years, any reference to the garden's original roots have disappeared altogether. That's that same path. But Vita wrote somewhere, I hope one day it would come good. So to understand Vita and Harold's original vision, we drew extensively on the archive research again and study of the flora of Delos. I sent 2 gardeners to the island to observe how and what plants grew there, and also to look at the typography of the built environment. So it was obvious if we were to enable these drought-tolerant Mediterranean species to thrive at Sissinghurst, we had to radically rethink the layout of the garden. So we looked at a set of mitigation strategies with the design, and we made raised beds by looking at how the street patterns worked in the city on Delos, but also how the agricultural terraces also were patterned. And we transferred those patterns into our new terrace walls at Sissinghurst. And so these terrace walls face south, and they allowed us to put a new layer of free-draining soil in. And you can see here the little terrace walls. And our masterstroke, really, was to face these terrace walls to the south. So it seems quite simple, but this is the lay of the land, drops by about a metre to the north. But by building these terrace walls here and sloping the ground backwards, just like you might turn a deck chair to the south, you're capturing all of that sunlight rather than it sliding off. And so that enabled what was a north-facing site to become sunny and open and suitable for these Mediterranean plantings. So this is our general layout plan. You can see the terracing, you can see this meridian line, that path that we saw in the photograph of Harold and Vita's Delos remains. And we also felt it was quite important that it wasn't a garden that Harold and Vita were trying to make. It was this idea of a landscape. And so within this quite small space, we also wanted the idea of a landscape to emerge. So along the path here, our walls, our typography would be as if it was footings of buildings. And then as you moved outwards from that central path, the walls would increasingly become more agrarian, as if they were just walls built by farmers to terrace the land, and walls where goats had pushed through and knocked over. And so this is the scary bit, where despite all the research and the permissions and the planning, we bring the heavy machinery in and start ripping up a well-loved garden. And our first move after the formation layer was really to think about the stones. We wanted Delos to feel like it was rising out of bedrock. And so about 5 massive stones were sourced, each weighing about 7 to 9 tonne, and then 50 smaller stones of around a tonne each. All of this rock comes from a quarry about 10 miles north of Sissinghurst. It's Kent Ragstone. It's the stone that's been used at Sissinghurst for centuries. And good drainage was key, of course, so ignore the little diagram because we've changed it since we drew the diagram. But in essence, for those of you who are interested, we had 300 tonnes of clean aggregate, so 20 to 40 mil in size, and that formed a 200 mil layer underneath what would be our new soil on top of that. And our soil then consisted of 50% of the same aggregate, but 5 to 10 millimetre in size, 25% crushed brick. We actually went from dust to 6. I would have preferred if we'd have gone 2 to 5 mil in size, because the dust element made it a bit sort of what we would call claggy, a little bit sticky. And then 25% free draining soil, on top of which we added a 50 to 75 millimetre layer of stone mulch. So a very free draining, open, gritty substrate for these Mediterranean plants to thrive and grow in. And because we wanted this area not to look or feel like a garden, rather than making a planting plan, we deliberately drew the area up into different fragana types, so hot, cool, shady, sunny, etc. And had a palette of plants for each area that we could draw upon and place and plant instinctively at the moment. In total, we placed around 6,000 plants, many of which we propagated in-house from seeds sent back from the Mediterranean Garden Society and other groups. And we were strict not to dispel the myth, and so our planting was chosen specifically from Greek origin, and a few from a wider Mediterranean region, but definitely not from Mediterranean climates from other parts of the world. So this was March 2020, just as we were finishing planting. And you can see, obviously, the stone is very much the obvious element there. The plants had yet to get going. In July of that same year, just when there was a break in COVID, it looked like this. And it's interesting to compare Sissinghurst Delos on the left with the Rail Delos on the right-hand side. And I think the team did such a good job, apart from not having the sort of wash of poppies. I think it looks pretty good. And then the following year, it looked like this. So Sissinghurst Delos on the left and Greek Delos on the right. And then probably 15 months after planting, we planted in 2 phases, October 19 and March 21. But about 15 months later, it looks like this. And when you think about what the rest of Sissinghurst looks like in middle of winter, actually most of that planting is underground. So interested seeing all the skeletal seed pods and structure of the Delos planting. Little time later, the combination of rock and stone and plants seems to be in just harmony. And then this year really has come into its own, and we're learning as gardeners how to garden this space, because it needs to look natural. So we have to mimic lightning and fire, and mimic goats grazing the plants. And I think Vita said if you could squint your eyes, you can just about see the Aegean Sea through the gap. But in addition to Sissinghurst, my team and I also look after 3 other gardens, Stoneacre, Small Hive Place and Lamb House. And if you haven't been to any of them, they're all well worth visiting. Talking of which, and if you allow me just to promote some garden tours, I know you enjoy your visits to England, and separate to my work at Sissinghurst, I really enjoy sharing my love of gardening, and I take a very few number of garden tours, and I take care of everything from the transport to finding amazing hotels to delicious food, and of course the best gardens. I seem to have unrivaled access to some of the masterpieces like Sissinghurst, but also some of the less known, rarely or never opened gardens. So if you've enjoyed this evening and we want to spend some more time together, get in touch. It would be great to to take you on some tours of some of our English gardens. But returning to Sissinghurst, and in summary, in time we hope to bring about a celebration of everything that is good about Sissinghurst. Rich, lavish, generous, fragrant, optimistic, and generous and romantic to the extreme. It may be that we cannot offer all the modern conveniences of a garden built as a tourist attraction. It may also be that we have to limit numbers that come into the garden at any one time. Common ground will have to be sought, but accepting the average is not an option. To create a pastiche or an ossified facsimile of Vita's garden would also be missing the point, but we should be open-minded about the restoration of authenticity. So in the years leading up to the garden's centenary in 2030, Sissinghurst offers a fascinating essay into the complexities and challenges facing the National Trust. On the one hand, balancing conservation with access, historical integrity with modern appeal, and central branding with property distinctiveness, and of course the new challenges of climate change. Shortly before Vita died at Sissinghurst in June 1962, she wrote to Harold saying, "How shall I sum up this garden? We have done our best and made a garden where there was none." Thank you very much.
I'll just move this down. Troy, wow, that was extraordinary. I think we could have heard a pin drop. I loved all the vintage photographs and showing us what's happened there. You may have stolen some of our support for scholarships, but you have given me an idea to make a video. Don't you think that we should have a video to sell the summer school? Anyhow, I think we could take one or two questions, but then we'll take you all across the hall to the library for a gala reception. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. You spoke so many times about the character of the garden as being romantic. What are the characters? How do you make a garden romantic?
Yeah, the question was, how do you make a garden romantic? It's a great question. I mean, for me, that sense of place is so important, isn't it? And you know, everywhere has that sense of where it is, of who we are. And for me, more than any garden, Sissinghurst seems to, well, the spirit of Vita still resonates very strongly for me. And it's got such a strong feeling of being cosy, being warm, being wrapped up, being surrounded by health, by this idea of comfort. And I suppose for me, they all perhaps not feel romantic, but feel these qualities that I want a garden to be. And I think it's so easy when we're gardening, just in our simple daily actions, of course, to erase those qualities. And so we try so hard to understand what they did, like I said, what Vita and Harold did. We try hard to use the same tools, we try hard to do and garden in the same way. And I'm deviating somewhat in answering your question, but I was blessed just a month or so ago. We had Sybil Kreutzberger, some of you might know Sybil. Sybil and Pam were joint head gardeners at Sissinghurst. Vita, in fact, employed them 2 years before she died, and they remained at Sissinghurst for 32 years, living and gardening there. And she hadn't been back for 32 years. And she came this year, and we, of course, spent a long time walking around and talking about and looking at the garden. She said some really, interesting things, and she said that, and this is really not the idea of romance, but she said when they got to Sissinghurst, they didn't think much of it. They didn't think there was a lot there, but they said that they very much followed the planting, the ideas that Vita had, and they worked with her, of course, for 2 years. And they continue to garden in the spirit of Vita, all for the 32 years. They retired in 1991. I came to Sissinghurst in 92. So I feel that thread is quite tightly woven still, that continuum. I don't know, in short, is it romantic or not, but I feel there's that connection, which is, for me, the important thing. And I feel that as a garden, that's romantic, immersive, emotional, rather than one that's driven by process. Sir?
I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the role of the walls and the more designed elements of it. Especially, I know there was an architect named Albert Poes, I think is how you say his name, and I was wondering, like, where that came in and how that's still, how you've dealt with the architectural legacy as well.
Yeah, great question. So Powys was Vita and Harold's architect, both on some of the building restorations and on the garden elements. And we look at their correspondence to each other. There's one funny comment. Powys had sent a little sketch of a bridge over the moat, and it was quite ornate, and Vita just had handwritten on the side, most unsuitable for Sissinghurst. But they corresponded regularly and in detail about details, talking about the widths of the paths, and should it be 2-inch wider or 2-inch narrower, that sort of detail. I mean, Harold, of course, loved his squared paper and was obviously helped very much by having the tower, being able to look down upon the garden and its layout. And he obviously also suggested various elements, and Vita often reined him in. So in the rondel, which is this circular yew hedge that we saw, I think at the centre of that he wanted this large Baroque fountain, which Vita persuaded him otherwise, and now we have just a green carpet of lawn. Elsewhere in the top courtyard we've got this large new wall from the 1930s, and again along that new wall they wanted to build this little loggia, and underneath the loggia would be busts of I don't know whom, but and again Vita reined him in. So there was lots of to-ing and fro-ing between Powys, the architect, Harold and Vita. But again, just like Pam and Sybil were with what they found when they came to the garden to garden there, Harold and Vita, I think, were very respectful about what they saw. They didn't take away any of the existing walls that they found. They added 2 new walls, the purple border wall and the wall that's curved, which we call the Powys wall, on the dais behind the rose garden. All the other walls were pre-existing Elizabethan Tudor walls. They added hedges, but they also referenced those original boundaries of the field hedges. So garden hedges might have replaced native hedges. And that's why I think this idea of romance, we come back to that. It's that thread of the past, that abandoned past, that embedded history, which I feel Sissinghurst has, and we lose at our risk. And so what you see at Sissinghurst is this series of 10 rooms formed by those pre-existing walls, and that main vista that we saw that runs through right from the head of the Lime Walk with the statue of Bashante through to the Little North Garden beyond the White Garden. Literally the full extent, the full width of the garden, that comes about by passing through a doorway of an Elizabethan wall. And it actually makes the lower courtyard such an odd shape. Too narrow, really, but it stems from that original doorway and not wanting to take away that, because it's part of this grain of the history. Maybe one more if it was, or no. It was just here on the left.
Well, this might be an oddball question, but I'm thinking of the larger property which you showed some images of, and I was curious because I'm so sorry. The impetus in England in rewilding is very, very strong, and I was wondering about the relationship between that and the garden. I was just recently in London and outside, and Waddesdon saw a healthy population of red kites, which are top-end predators, and were brought in from elsewhere with all best intentions. I was curious if this has had any relationship or impact with the garden itself.
The question was around the idea of rewilding, a big topic, of course, at the moment. And interestingly, flying over last night, I listened to Isabella Tree. There's a short film called Wilding. And, of course, Isabella Tree, some of you will have listened to. She came over, I think, with the Garden Conservancy to do some talks. And she has a garden called the NEP, which is probably one of our first and most advanced rewilding exercises. It's not a trust garden, it's a private garden, but again in the south of England. We're not rewilding at Sissinghurst. It's a productive farm. It's full of Sussex cattle and sheep and arable crops. However, we are approaching it differently. You know, there was zero margins. It was contract farmed in the past. We've now got our own in-house farmer, and we discussed with that farmer the plan. And so, as I explained, we've got much more areas set aside for wildlife, and that's right. You know, so many of our wildlife has disappeared from the area. So, as well as doing the audit within the garden, we've also undertaken our biodiversity audit beyond the garden. We've now got nightingales back at Sissinghurst. We've got barn owls, you know, and all of these didn't exist when I lived on the estate in the early 1990s. So I wouldn't call it rewilding. It's farming sensibly and allowing just room for nature. Thank you.
Thank you all again, and I invite you to join us at the reception across the hall.
We're going to leave that there, pick it up later. Be okay, yeah.